Okay, so now we have root and fifth as our established tones, and the variable will be the third note. Let's go through this rather quickly. If I choose to play the root and the fifth, I have a couple ways I could play that. I can go up to the fifth, or I go down to the fifth. And that's very important you establish the direction of your first two notes. So if I decide to go like root and flat third, root and fifth, I'm just using the root as my destination tone, right? So look at, play it up here, for example. Now that's getting into that stretched out realm. So that's not a real colorful lick because it's just down to ground. It's just the power chord. But knowing this helps you say, okay, I want to spice it up a little bit. We'll use some of those grace notes. So I might go. Now, how are we going to finger this? This is where you might choose to play the 5 in a different place. Because if you play them, if I lay it out strictly in my minor pentatonic scale, there's nothing wrong with that. So I'll go. Right? Or I can go. Different places I could play it. And I put in a little grace note, or I could go. Now look what, this is what might be happening. Let me explain this. Let's say you're on this lesson. You say, okay, I got my 1, I got my 5, and I'm going to come back to the 1. And I want to use the flat 3 as an upper neighbor grace note for my destination tone. You see it, you go, and then oh, I got to jump over here. That's awkward. Doesn't work out too well, right? Now you could lay it out that way. That'd work if you want to sweep it. But you see, that's what you lay it out in a different position. So make sure that you look at how it's laid out. Okay, so root fifth, coming back to the root, right? Now you have a couple ways. If you're laying it out on one string, you go. That's root, fifth, back to the root, or root up to the fifth. Now that's practical in the higher registers, but I just want to kind of show you that you can play in that modern style where everything's all stretched out and laid out on one string, or you can just stay in traditional form, one position. That's fine. So that's using the root as our destination. What if we decide to use the 5? Now we're getting into some standard kind of licks that riff would be 1, 5, 4 to 5 with 4 as a grace note, or did you hear that little bit of staccato I put on there? You'll be tempted to do the same thing I just did, where you play the lick, but then it becomes a theme and you branch off of it, and so on. So that's 5 and 5 again. You can bend up to it, you can hammer on all the different things. You can. Here's the upper neighbor of the 5. 2, 3, 4. Now what I'm doing right here, I go. But listen to this. Here's another little embellishment that you could play. We've been using, in terms of grace notes, if it was an upper grace note, we would use a pull-off in most cases. Sometimes a slide, right? Sometimes a pre-bend, quick release. Here's another option. A real quick hammer pull. Here's your destination tone, the 5. You're using the flat 7. So, see how you can play it with staccato and without? I'm going quickly. Keep your ears open. Here it is. Nice and legato. Here it is. That little bit of staccato. Make sure you experiment. And while we're on this subject, we could put a grace note on the second note. We can put a grace note on the first note. We can do all kinds of cool things with these grace notes. So if you think you've spent enough time on the lick, you probably haven't. Go and explore one lick and see how far you can take it in terms of grace notes and embellishments. Okay, so if we decide to use the lower neighbor as a grace note, we had hammer-ons and legato slides and quick bends. Those were options, right? You could pick it too, but hammer-ons were probably the most convenient. Well, you can also go use a pull-hammer combination to get a real quick 1, 5, 5, 4, 5, real quick. And then, now, just food for thought. We've been using grace notes that were always either the next highest note or the next lowest note in the scale. Once you're cooking on this, you can always start saying, all right, I'm going to do something like this. You see what I'm doing? The 5, the 4 would be the lower neighbor, but we go down. Does that make sense? If I did the same thing, or a lot of different ways you could play that, see? So, you aren't restricted to just the next lowest or next highest note as your grace notes. Start with that. Once you're really solid on that, then you have another place you could take it. So that was going 1, 5, and then 5. Well, we're going to change our last note. We already explored the 1 and the 5 as our notes. Let's make the flat 7 our third note. This will sound kind of nice against the track. Look at your options here. 1, 5, flat 7, going up to it, and I can slide up to it and hammer on, or I can now, there's some more room for, watch this. Here I go again. If my flat 7 is my final tone, we've been talking about using the upper neighbor or the lower neighbor, and then I said you could also approach it, but I can also, and these come from classical music, if this is my destination tone, I could do the higher neighbor, the lower neighbor, and then target. So my 1, flat 3, 1, 5, and then I'm going to play. This basic lick is still 1, 5, flat 7, right? But I got to spruce it up a little bit. So I go. And now we're kind of branching off from the rhythmic idea. I mean, it's still da, da, da. But we're doing some extra stuff in there on that kick, on the and of 2. 1, 2, and 3, 4. But that's 1, 5, flat 7. Now that's cool because if you play and go down to the flat 7, got that cool kind of Hendrix sound because you're coming right out of these intervals of 6 here, the flat 7 to 5. Now there's an example of a lick. Let me turn off some of these effects so you can hear this. If my riff is 1, 5, flat 7, I lay it out this way. I'm going to grace note the second note. But I'm not going to use a hammer-on because I want it to be a little slinkier. What happens on this riff is I play the 1, then I hop over to the 4, bend up to the 5, cut it off to get out of it because I don't want to release, and I play the flat 7. 1. It's a cool lick, but you see it's just springing right off of what we're doing here. So that's using the lower neighbor of the second note in our formula. Even if I played this, 1, 4 to 5 real quick, and then the flat 7. A lot of different ways you could finger it. You can do legato, staccato, whatever you want. Okay, so that's using the flat 7. What if we decide to go to the flat 3? That's a pretty good sounding riff. It doesn't sound as square, for lack of a better term. When we went 1, flat 3, 5, it's so obvious that it's a minor arpeggio. But this, you're starting with your strongest tone, then you're hitting the second strongest tone, the 5, and then you're hitting your blue note, which you can do some great stuff. Big wide vibrato. You can bend it. 2, 3, 4. It just springs right into some great riffs, and you're always having this strong ba, ba, ba as your outline. Let's use the 4 as our final note. It's not real strong, is it? So let's put it to work. By using the weakness of the 4th, it enabled me to finish my sentence. It was sort of like I started a phrase, put a comma in there, because you say, well, it needs to kind of complete itself. The phrase didn't come to a conclusion. Use that 4 specifically for that as a tool. Now, this is because we're just soloing over the 1 chord, over the E7. Remember that when you're playing a blues, and I said this in an earlier lesson, you're using that E minor pentatonic scale, but when you're on the 4 chord, all the numbers change. I talk about that in the bluesology in a lot of my courses. It's very important to think vertically even when you're playing the blues and just staying in the minor pentatonic scale. But that 1 of the 4 chord is really the 4 of the 1 chord, this A note. So make sure you explore that. Okay, so I quickly went through some options. I think you see it's growing. It's one of those seeds that grows into a big vine that just takes over. And that's the beauty of this whole thing.